Over and over again, he kept experiencing the same thing, a bright flash of light followed by searing pain, then darkness. From time to time, he would hear voices but couldn't make out who they were from or what they were saying. He tried to speak but couldn't. He tried to move but was unable to. This time, however, the light was different. It was like looking through a fog, but he couldn't make anything out and couldn't focus on it. Shadowy figures passed before him, and he tried calling out but couldn't. He began hearing noises, but nothing he heard made any sense. He forced himself to move but wasn't able to. He tried screaming, but nothing came out. Exhausted, he stopped to rest, and the darkness came over him again. A while later, he didn't know how long, the light returned. He willed himself to move and was finally able to, but it took all of his strength. He tried to yell, but the only thing that came out was a sickly gurgle. He felt like something was in his throat keeping him from talking. A shadow moved in front of him, stopped for a moment, and then ran off, making a loud noise. He saw more shadows this time, coming closer and gathering around him. He blinked his eyes, hoping to clear his vision. The shadows moved quickly around him, doing things he couldn't understand. Then he heard someone speak. "Mr. Smith, can you hear me?" a man's voice said. Who the hell was Mr. Smith, he wondered. Nevertheless, he could hear the man and tried nodding his head. It took a lot of work, but he finally managed a weak nod. As his vision began to clear, he could tell that he was in a hospital bed, and the people around him, all dressed in medical garb, were working frantically to bring him back to consciousness. A man he presumed was a doctor mentioned something about seeing if he could breathe on his own. Soon he felt tape being pulled off his face and something being pulled out of his throat. Panting, he suddenly realized his throat was clear of obstruction and took a few tentative breaths on his own, relishing the feel of inhaling air on his own. "Good, good," the man said. As he looked around, he saw a number of wires attached to his body, along with a blood pressure cuff on his upper arm and 4 inserted into his lower arm. He could also feel the catheter that had been placed inside his penis. Looking at the wall, he saw the thinnest television he had ever seen in his life and noticed the ticker along the bottom of the screen that mentioned something about President Trump. Trump, he asked himself. How long had he been here? The last he knew, Barack Obama had only been in the White House for a few months. How long? He asked weakly. The doctor looked at his thick chart before answering. From what I can tell, about 10 years, Mr. Smith, he said. 10 years? What the hell happened? And who was this Smith guy they all referred to, he wondered. Just relax, Mr. Smith. We're going to check you out and get you set up for rehab. As he watched, the nurses took his arms and legs out of the restraints holding him in the bed, and the doctor made adjustments in his notes. He looked at another nurse before speaking. Do we have Mr. Smith's contact information available? He asked. A young nurse looked in her computer and answered in the affirmative. Very well, reach out and let them know, the doctor said. The nurse began making a call, and the man wondered who would be coming to see him. His memory was still a bit foggy, but he remembered being married with an 8-year-old daughter. My God, he thought, my daughter Jenny would be 18 now and probably ready to go to college. He thought about his wife Lydia, but, for some reason, didn't seem too interested in seeing her. Something about seeing his wife repulsed and angered him, though he wasn't quite sure what. Well, Mr. Smith, the doctor said, your vitals look good, but we're going to run some tests anyway. Once we get those back, we'll get this feeding tube out of you and get you up to your room. You're going to be our guest for a little while, but we'll get you into a rehab facility and get you back on your feet, okay? The man nodded. Doctor, he said, who's Smith? The doctor looked down at his notes before looking back at him. Why, you are, he said. It seems you may be experiencing some amnesia. I'm not surprised, really, you've been through a lot. That's okay, we'll get someone in to work with you now. You just relax and we'll get you set up. With that, the doctor left, giving instructions to a couple of nurses on his way out. The man knew who he was, and it wasn't this Smith character. His name was Avery Wilson. He was born in 1972 to Dan and Barbara Wilson and had a brother, Robert, who was a year older than him. He joined the army at 18, right out of high school, and was trained to become a sniper. He spent the next 4 years in various trouble spots around the world, including Kuwait. He survived Desert Storm and finally got out in 1994, returning home to Southern California, where he completed his associate degree in criminal justice in 1996. He had always wanted to be a policeman, so he joined the LAPD, where his military training was put to use. After graduating from the police academy, he was made a sharpshooter. In 1997, he met Lydia Jackson, and after 2 years of dating, married her in 1999. Things were great, he thought, and their daughter, Jennifer, came along in October 2000. He stayed with the force while his wife worked as an attorney for the same firm where his brother was a partner. He won a rather large lottery in late 2008, and things went downhill from there. Around the time he won the lottery, he learned quite by accident that his wife had been in a long-standing affair with his brother. Fortunately, his good friend and confidant, Ben Jacobs, had talked him into letting him set up an overseas account under a different name so Lydia couldn't access most of his lottery winnings. Ben, being an expert in financial matters, managed the account for him. He also put him in contact with a real shark of an attorney who hated cheating spouses and despised Robert even more. Ben set up surveillance on Lydia and Robert and managed to get pictures and video of their trysts. He had planned on confronting his wife about her affair, but something happened that he couldn't remember. He was sure that the details would come back to him soon. The next thing he remembered was waking up in this hospital ward, 10 years later. Exhausted, he laid his head back down and watched the television as the nurses did their jobs. But who was this Smith character? What was that all about? He considered his life as he watched the local news. According to the news, Robert Wilson had declared himself a candidate for public office. He wondered if this Robert Wilson could possibly be his brother. As he watched, a well-dressed man with a bit of gray at his temples addressed a group of people outside a building somewhere in downtown Los Angeles. Next to him were 2 women, Lydia and a teenage girl who looked like a grown-up version of his Jenny. "And I promise the people of this great state that I'll bring ethics and accountability back into our state government," Robert said to some fanfare. "Sacramento is out of control, and we need to get back to basics." After this, Robert turned and kissed Lydia on the cheek. She was 2 years younger than Avery, and he thought she had the best looks money could buy. Wilson, who was joined by his wife and daughter, made his announcement this afternoon and is already ahead in the polls. Since the tragic shooting death of his brother Avery in 2009, Wilson has worked with the families of fallen police officers, the news announcer said, showing a picture of him in his police uniform. "What the hell?" the man thought as he watched the report. "Death? I'm not dead," he said to himself. "And what's this about Jenny being Robert's daughter?" He laid his head back down and tried to remember the last few days before he ended up in the hospital, but his mind kept drawing a blank. His mind wandered back over the main events of his life, hoping to find an answer. He thought about Robert, his older brother. For as long as he could remember, Robert was the bane of his existence. Not only was he a bully, but he delighted in taking whatever he could from his younger brother, money, credit for whatever he did, his possessions, even his girlfriends. It seemed that no matter what he had, Robert wanted it, whether he needed it or not. Worse yet, his parents went along with whatever Robert said or did. If Robert did something wrong, he always turned it around so his parents would end up punishing the younger sibling. Avery grew up hating his older brother, and the crap he put up with from his parents didn't help. Robert was the good son who would make something of himself, leaving Avery to be the black sheep. It was so bad that he never told his family he had enlisted. He had just graduated from high school and was off to boot camp the next day. He had signed the enlistment papers one day after school was out, went through all the physicals, and was set to go. No one even knew where he was until he was forced to call home. "You did what?" his father roared when he called. "Get your bum back home right now, young man." Avery said, "I'm over 18 and I'm already in boot camp. There's not a goddamn thing you can do about it. Don't expect to hear from me again." And with that, he slammed the phone down, ending the call. He kept his word and never communicated with any of them until he graduated from the police academy in 1997. That wasn't his choice, by the way. They learned from the LAPD that he would be graduating and showed up to see him. He never forgot that day. He spotted them while standing in formation. After the speeches, they stood to receive their certificates, and he saw them, including Robert, watching him. He became the newest officer on the force. After the ceremony, he tried his best to get away quickly but was stopped when they blocked his path, and they didn't look too happy. "You're not getting away from us again, Avery," his father said. "I knew you'd finally make something of yourself. I had hoped you would have gone to college to be a lawyer like your brother and me." Robert smirked, but the smirk quickly left his face. "Yeah, well, this is my choice, and it's something you can't take from me," Avery said, glancing at Robert. "And for your information, I did make something of myself in the Army." "Avery, please," his mother, Barbara, said. "We haven't seen or heard from you in 7 years. Can't you please be civil to us just once? Maybe if just once you and Dad had given me some benefit of the doubt, things would have been different. But no, you always listened to him, always took his side in everything, and never once gave me the time of day," he said. "This is my day, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let you screw it up for me." "Avery," Robert said, "I don't get it. Why do you hate me so much? Are you kidding me? You were a bully. You took everything I ever had, even my girlfriends," he said. "You blamed me for every shitty thing you did, and you got them to believe all of your lies." He added, motioning to his parents. His parents were shocked to hear him talk this way. He was always so quiet, so polite. Who was this man before them, they wondered. "So guess what, asshole? I'm through with you. I've paid my dues and I'm making my own life, so stay out of it," he told Robert, his eyes burning with hatred. "Avery, son, what happened to you?" his mother asked, shocked at her son's language. This wasn't the same quiet man who took whatever they dished out to him. He looked at his mother. "I grew up, Mother," he said. "I became a soldier, and you know what? I've even killed men in combat." She backed up a bit after hearing that. He continued, "Don't worry, Mother, they were all bad guys and deserved it. I'm not the same person who grew up in your house, and I don't take crap from anyone." He looked at Robert before continuing. "Ever." He turned and walked away from them, leaving them open-mouthed. He didn't see them again until the day he married Lydia. He met her at a police event shortly after becoming a cop. At the time, she worked in the public defender's office but was looking for a job with a major firm. He proposed a year to the day they met, and she accepted. They decided to have a long engagement to make sure things would work out and got married a year later. Divorces were quite common among police officers. He never invited his family to the wedding, but they showed up anyway. He saw them during the reception when Lydia pointed them out. "Isn't that your family?" she asked, pointing to his parents and Robert. "Yeah," he said. "I don't know why they're here." "You have to introduce me, please," she begged. Avery gave in and walked his bride over to them. They smiled as Avery introduced his wife. "Well, it's so good to finally meet you," Avery's father said. "I don't understand, Avery. Why didn't we get an invitation to your wedding?" his mother asked. "Must have been an oversight or something," Avery said. The truth was he never invited them. "I hear you're going to be joining our firm soon," Dan said. Avery looked shocked as he looked at him. "Oh, I'm sorry, Avery. Didn't you know? The board just accepted her today." "No, I didn't know," Avery said, as Robert smirked. "I'm sorry, Avery. I didn't know I had been accepted until just now," Lydia said. Avery nodded his head. "That's okay, dear," he said. "We'll talk about it later. Mind if I have a dance with my new sister-in-law?" Robert asked with a smirking grin. Avery pulled him off to the side and spoke to him in a quiet tone so no one else could hear. "Listen up, asshole," he told his older brother. "This isn't high school. She's my wife, not some schoolgirl. I understand, Robert responded condescendingly. Avery grabbed his shoulder. No, you don't. Do you know what I did in the army? Robert shook his head. No. I assume you were some kind of clerk or something. No, I was a sniper. I killed scumsuckers like you for a living, and I can blow your balls off from 1,000 yards away. Understand? The smirk left Robert's face, and he looked at his younger brother, shocked. Is that a threat, Avery? He asked. Avery shook his head. No, asshole. It's a goddamn promise, he replied. Okay, Avery. I got it, Robert said. Hands off. Message received. They walked back to Lydia and his parents. May I have a dance, please? Robert asked in a respectful tone. Lydia looked at Avery, who nodded his head in permission. What did you tell him? His father asked after they left. I gave him a bit of sage brotherly advice, Avery said, watching his wife and brother dance. He was relieved to see they kept a respectful distance from each other. He turned back to his father. You know, Robert always managed to take my girlfriends when we were in school. I know, Avery, his father said. Believe me when I tell you I didn't approve of it. Yeah, well, you never did anything to stop it either, even when he rubbed it in my face right in front of you, Avery told him. This is different. She's my wife, and I damn well expect you to enforce your firm's morals clause. I understand, Avery, his father said. Look, I'm sorry about everything that's happened, but it's all in the past. Can't we just put it behind us and move forward, please? Avery, his mother added, can you please set your hatred for us aside so we can be a family again? We'll see, Mother, Avery said. Barbara smiled. That's all I ask. I know you don't believe me, but we really do love you and we're so proud of what you've done, she said. Avery nodded and accepted his mother's hug. Thank you. You're right, I don't believe you, but deep down, I love you too. There's a lot of hurt that needs to heal, and you can start by making sure he doesn't get his hooks into my wife, he added, looking at his father. I understand, son. I'll take care of it personally. See that you do, Avery replied. As his wife and brother returned, leaving the reception for their honeymoon in Las Vegas, Avery turned to see Robert and his father discussing something quietly while looking at them. He hoped for the best, but experience had taught him to expect the worst. On the way to Vegas, Lydia talked to him about his relationship with his family. You know, your brother really is a very charming man, she said. Even after he asked me to call him Bobby, said all his friends call him that, but you don't, and he's your brother. Why? Avery told her about his childhood, how his brother had taken everything he had, even his girlfriends. He shared the story of the spankings and groundings he received for things his brother had done and how his parents always sided with Robert over him. So when the time came to leave, I did, he said. I put it all behind me and built my own life. Oh my God, I never knew, Lydia said. And they never mentioned you at all. Honestly, if I had known any of this, I never would have applied at their firm. It's okay, Avery told her, but forewarned is forearmed. Watch out for Robert. He's trouble, and yes, his charm is just a tool to get his way. Trust me, I've seen it happen too many times. You can trust me, sweetie, she said. I'll never do anything to hurt you, ever. He believed her, but he lived by the motto trust but verify. He kept an eye on her, what she wore to work, the time she had to work late, the way she smelled when she came home, and her general demeanor. 2 years after their marriage, Jenny was born. She was his little girl and could always be counted on to make him happy. Lydia turned out to be a great mother as well. For the first several years, his wife gave no indication that anything was wrong, not even at the firm's various parties and functions. He even started warming up to his parents a bit and let them spend time with their granddaughter, but he still kept an eye on things. If there was something happening, they were very good at covering it up. He met Ben Jacobs, an all-round master of various trades, financial planning, private investigations, you name it, at a police seminar in San Diego in November 2008. The two hit it off, especially since Ben was also an Army veteran. They became fast friends, and Avery felt he could trust the man with his life. That was when he first learned of Lydia's cheating. The previous Christmas, he had bought 2 new Apple iPhones, which featured a virtual keyboard and allowed text messages to be sent. He kept one for himself and gave her the other. His reasoning was that they would help the two of them keep in touch no matter where they were. He was on his way back to their home in Los Angeles County when his phone dinged, letting him know he had a message. He looked at the screen and was shocked at what he saw. Had a great time tonight, lover. See you tomorrow. He verified the text came from Lydia's phone and put the phone away. While he didn't know who the lover was, he suspected it was Robert since he didn't know who else she might see. The next day, he knew they often worked together on various projects and cases. He had to come up with a plan before he got home, so he pulled off the freeway in Orange County and called Ben. "Hey, Avery, what's up?" Ben asked. "Avery, I got a strange message on my phone and I need some help. Think you could work as my PI for a little while?" he asked. "Sure, but it'll cost you," Ben said. "Yeah, okay," Avery agreed. He explained what had happened, and Ben said he would start looking into it. "In the meantime, don't do anything stupid," Ben said. "Don't go blowing your brother's balls off, you hear me?" "Yeah, I hear you. Give me some time. It might take me a bit to get some evidence you can use against them, especially since they've been so careful up until now," Ben told him. "Okay, stay in touch," Avery replied. "We do," Ben said, ending the call. How could she? Avery asked himself. He fought back the tears but lost. Even now, he teared up thinking about that day. The nurse's voice brought him back to the present. "Are you all right, Mr. Smith?" the nurse asked. He suddenly realized he was crying and wiped his eyes. "Yeah," he croaked through parched lips. "Can I get something to drink?" "Sure, Mr. Smith." "I'll be right back," she said, walking to the nurse's station. She came back a moment later with a cup of ice water. As he sipped the water, the doctor came into the room. "Well, good news, Mr. Smith," he said. "All of your tests came back good, so we're going to get that feeding tube out of you and get you up to your room." A couple of nurses came into the room and began working on him. Soon, he was being transported to a private room where he actually got to eat real food for the first time in a decade. He watched the news as he ate, and when he was finished, he heard a knock on the door. "Come in," he said, his voice still weak. "Johnny boy, how are you doing?" the man said as he came inside. Avery looked at him and didn't recognize him at first. "It's me, Ben. Remember?" "Yeah, I was just thinking about you," he said. Ben sat down next to Avery's bed and pulled up a briefcase after closing the door. "How are you feeling?" he asked as he opened the case. Avery nodded his head. "Weak, but getting stronger." "Tell me, Ben, what the hell happened? Why does everyone keep calling me Mr. Smith, and why did you call me Johnny?" "That's because Avery Wilson died 10 years ago," Ben said. Avery, or Jan, looked at him, shocked. "What? How?" he asked. "But I'm still alive." Ben shook his head. "No, Avery is dead. Your name is John Smith according to the official record. Avery was killed during a home invasion that took place when he went back to get some things out of his house. How much do you remember?" The man shook his head, then pulled out a laptop and set it up in front of him. "Watch this," he said, bringing up a video. The video showed his wife, Robert, and Dan in a hotel room. Lydia was having sex with Dan and Robert. After their climax, they sat on the bed and sipped their drinks. "Avery will be coming over tomorrow to get the rest of his things," Dan said. "Good," Dan replied. "We can take care of him then." He looked at Robert. "Think you have the balls to blow your own brother away?" Robert laughed. "Seriously?" he asked. "Hell yes. I've been wanting to do that scum-sucker in for a long time." Dan and Lydia smiled. "See that you do," Dan said. Make it look like a home invasion, and for crying out loud, clean yourself up good and don't leave anything behind." "I've got it under control," Robert said. As J.N. sat shocked at hearing his family plot to murder him, Ben brought up another video. This one showed Avery tied to a chair while Robert and Lydia were on the bed naked, having sex. After they finished, they sat on the bed and looked at Avery, who was shaking his head. He tried to cry out but was gagged and couldn't say anything. Robert grabbed a shotgun and pointed it at Avery as Lydia laughed. Well, look here," he said in the video. "The stupid cuck is waking up. Finally, wakey." As Avery focused on the scene before him, he began struggling. "Don't waste your time, little brother. What do you think? I've taken your wife, your daughter is really mine, and now I'm going to take your life," he said as Lydia laughed. He pointed the shotgun and fired once, knocking Avery in the chair over. "Is he dead?" Lydia asked. "Please tell me you killed him." Robert walked over to Avery and prodded the body with the shotgun. Getting no response, he put the shotgun down. "Help me get him out of this chair," he told Lydia. "It has to look like he was shot by a burglar." Lydia got off the bed and joined Robert, and the two of them took Avery out of the chair, arranging his body so it looked as though he was surprised and shot by an intruder. They took a shower, changed clothes, and left. The video ended but picked up later when Avery's body was put on a gurney by paramedics. As they watched, Lydia and Robert were heard crying in the background. "So, you had video of Robert shooting me but did nothing with it?" John asked. "I had no choice," Ben said. "The feds told me to bury it. It seems your father and brother were under investigation for work they've been doing with some rather shady characters, organized crime." J.N. asked, "Hell, who do you think is bankrolling your brother's run for the state senate?" "So how did I survive?" J.N. asked. "Apparently, someone upstairs really likes you," Ben said. "There was a lot of damage, but fortunately, Robert is a much better lawyer than Shooter. It was a bit of a medical miracle that you survived at all. If you hadn't gone into a coma, the feds would have had you under witness protection. As it was, they were able to make it look as though you had died. They even got hold of a body that looked a lot like you for the funeral." "Was Lydia there?" John asked. Ben laughed and nodded his head. "Oh yeah, she played the grieving widow role to the hilt," Ben said. J.N. laughed. "What about Jennifer?" John asked. "She'll be going to college soon. She's missed you a lot and blames her mother for what happened. She's quite resourceful. You'd be really proud of her." "So, who's been paying for all this?" John asked. "Well, you remember that lottery ticket you won?" he asked. John nodded. "You trusted me with it, if you recall. So I made some investments and put it all in an offshore account. It's grown quite a bit, and that's what's been paying for your hospital stay. There's enough in that account to take care of you for the rest of your life if you're careful." "Thank you for that," John said. "My pleasure," Ben replied. "So, what do you see happening from here on?" "I'd like to see my daughter," John said. "And I need to get revenge on the a-holes who did this to me. All of them." Ben nodded his head. "I understand," he said. "I had a feeling you might say that." They talked for a while longer and discussed their plans for the future, which included revenge on Lydia, Robert, and Avery's parents. John even considered putting his sniper skills to use against them, but Ben talked him out of it. "Wouldn't you rather see them suffer for a while first?" Ben asked, a wicked smile coming over his face. "What do you have in mind?" John asked, his mood improving considerably as Ben laid out a potential plan. By the time Ben left, John was in a great mood. He even embraced his new identity with a vengeance. Oh yes, he thought to himself, they would all pay for what they had done to him. He spent the next few days in the hospital getting stronger with each passing day. His mind went over the events that led to his shooting, and he thought back to the final days of his previous life, December 2008. After Avery received the text message from Lydia, he authorized Ben to set up hidden cameras and microphones in his house. Ben went all out and even placed hidden microphones in his wife's car. He had no idea where the devices were, which he surmised was probably a good idea. Ben somehow managed to set up hidden cameras in their offices. He didn't know how his friend managed that and didn't ask. 2 weeks after getting the text, he received an email from his friend asking him to come by his office. "Hey, Avery," Ben said as he walked in and shook hands. "Are you ready for this?" Avery shook his head. "I don't know," he said. Ben nodded his head in understanding. "It's not pretty." He held out a large packet of photos that showed Lydia and Robert in a variety of compromising positions. From what he could tell, all of their trysts took place either in a hotel room or their office. Some of the photos showed Lydia with both Robert and his father, Dan, at the same time. One photo even showed his mother, Barbara, was also involved. It took everything he had to keep from getting sick. "There's more," Ben said, starting a video on his computer. As Avery watched, Lydia was performing oral sex on his father. He recognized his father's office. Once they finished, Dan poured them a drink, and they settled into their seats, still naked. "You know, we've been very careful to keep all this from Avery," Lydia said. "But you know he's going to figure it out pretty soon. He may be a Boy Scout, but he's not stupid." Robert and his father laughed. "Please," Robert said condescendingly. "We've been doing this for what, 5 or 6 years? He still hasn't figured it out yet. We could probably screw right in front of him, and he wouldn't know what's going on." "Maybe we should fill him in this Christmas," Robert said. "How about this? After dinner this Christmas, we slip him a little something and let him watch. We'll give him a little incentive, and if he doesn't go along with the program, then we revert to Plan B." "Plan B?" Lydia asked. "You mean let our friends from back east take him out?" "Something like that," Dan said. "Your husband isn't the only sniper out there, you know." Lydia laughed. "You think Barb will go along with that?" "Who do you think came up with the idea?" Dan said. Lydia lifted her glass. "Well then, here's to Barb and Christmas dinner," she said, smiling. The two men joined her. Avery felt even sicker after the video ended. "My God," he said. "They're all in on it, even my mother." "Avery, you need to be very careful going forward," Ben said. "There are other videos in here as well, and they're all just as bad. So far, they've been very careful. From what I've been able to determine, they've only been getting together about once a week or so until just the last few months." Ben pulled out a business card. "I've taken the liberty of setting you up with the meanest divorce lawyer in the area. I've already given her the evidence I've shown you," he said. "Use my phone and set up an appointment. She's waiting to hear from you." Avery called and arranged to see the attorney that afternoon. "What about their plot to take me out?" Avery asked. "I've provided that info to the FBI," Ben said. "But I'm not convinced anything's going to come from it. Right now, it's just talk. There's no evidence to suggest anything has actually been arranged. The bottom line, Avery, is that you need to be very careful. Act normally if you can. I know it's going to be hard, but you have to protect yourself. Anyway, keep in touch, and I'll let you know if I get anything else." Avery thanked his friend and headed out to see his attorney. He made it to the office of Sally McIntosh, his attorney. The receptionist ushered him in after he introduced himself. "Good afternoon, Officer Wilson," Sally said, shaking his hand. "Please, call me Avery, Miss McIntosh," he said. "Only if you call me Sally," she responded. She pulled out a large folder and got right to business. Avery was impressed. "I already spoke with Ben, and he provided me with the evidence he collected. I must tell you, this is probably the most messed up situation I've ever seen in my career." "So, what are you expecting out of this?" Sally asked. "Well, I'd like custody of my daughter if she really is mine, and I don't want to give her any support. I'd also like to go after Robert and my ex-parents," Avery said. Sally nodded. "You know that California is a no-fault state as far as divorce is concerned," she said. We can file under irreconcilable differences and use the evidence as a bargaining chip in the division of property. As for custody, I'm afraid you're going to be on the short end of the stick there, as most judges here give custody to the mother. There's a chance that, given your wife's earnings, you might be able to avoid paying support. We can make that argument and see what the judge says. What about Robert and the rest of my family? He asked. Unfortunately, California law doesn't allow for lawsuits citing alienation of affection. We might be able to find other grounds for a lawsuit, but I'm not too sure anything will come of it, Sally said. All right, Avery said. Do what needs to be done. When would you like to have her served? Sally asked. Avery thought for a moment. Christmas Day, he said, at my parents' house. Sally laughed. You're cold-blooded, she said. Divorce for Christmas, I like it. Given what I've seen, I'll also arrange for an order of protection to keep her and your family as far away from you as possible. Thanks, Avery said. I'm really sorry about all this, Avery. You seem like a good man, Sally said, ending the meeting. Avery drove home in a fog, processing everything he had seen and heard. Never in his life would he have thought that his entire family would conspire against him like this. Lydia sensed that something was wrong and tried to approach him. What's wrong, dear? She asked. Avery shook his head in disbelief. I just have a lot on my mind, he said. One of my friends found out his wife is cheating on him. He's really taking it very hard. I'm sorry to hear that, she said. I'd never do that to you. Yeah, right, he thought. You know that, don't you? He looked at her before shaking his head. I hope to God you never do, he said in a monotone. Lydia wasn't sure how to take this. Does he really know? She asked herself. He stayed in his study after she left and looked at the evidence Ben had given him. He shook his head in disbelief. Are you coming to bed? Lydia asked. Avery shook his head and waved her off. I've got a lot on my mind. You go on up, he said. He ended up sleeping on the couch in his study. Lydia woke him up the next morning. Why didn't you come to bed last night? She asked. I was looking forward to some loving. He looked at her in disbelief. I was just going through some things, he said. Well, you know we have our company Christmas party tonight, right? She asked. He nodded. I'll expect you at the office about 4:30 this afternoon. And I hope your mood improves before then. Yeah, sure, he said. She bent down to kiss him and hit his cheek as he turned his head. Love you, she said as she walked out. Yeah, me too, he said half-heartedly. Does he know? She asked herself as she walked out. That afternoon, Avery went to his wife's Christmas party, which was always held at the office where she worked. Robert met him as he walked in. Well, look who the cat dragged in, he said, his speech slurred from alcohol. Avery shook off the offer of a drink and grabbed a bottle of water. What, you're too good to drink with us now? Robert asked. I'm still on duty, Avery said. And I hope you're not planning to drive tonight. What is little brother going to do? Arrest me? Robert slurred. Only if you break the law, Avery said. Lydia and his father came up to him. Lydia went to kiss him, but he turned his head. Avery's threatening to arrest me, Robert said. Can you believe that? Dan looked at him. I'd probably arrest you too, after all you've had to drink, Dan said. He reached out to shake Avery's hand. Good to see you, son. Come on in and join the party. Avery kept his hand on his sidearm and followed his father and wife. Lydia wrapped her arm around her husband. Relax, she said. You look like you're expecting someone to attack you. Avery looked at his wife. Police in uniform are always targets, you know that, he said. He took in his surroundings and noticed the looks of pity he received. A few of Lydia's co-workers shook his hand and thanked him for his service, but he saw it in their eyes, they knew. After a while, he excused himself and went to the men's room. Robert was there, washing his hands. Avery saw the large diamond-encrusted Rolex on his arm. "Nice watch," Avery said. "Is that new?" Robert took it off and handed it to Avery. "Yeah," he said. "It was a gift." Avery looked at it and turned it over. "Merry Christmas, with all our love, your two girls, Lydia and Jenny," the inscription said. Avery handed the watch back, taking in a smirk on Robert's face. "Nice," Avery said as he finished. He washed his hands and left before Robert could say anything. He caught up with Lydia and his father as they were talking to someone. "I have to go," he said. "Something has come up, and I need to deal with it." Lydia turned to kiss him, but he left before she could say or do anything. He didn't look back. At that point, he didn't care. After his shift ended, he went to a bar and nursed a couple of beers before heading home. Why did she do it? He asked himself. Lydia was home by the time he got there, and she was pissed. "Where were you?" she asked. "I finished my shift and went for a couple of beers," he said. "What do you care anyway?" "I care," she said. "You're my husband, and I love you." "How much did Robert's Rolex cost you?" he asked. Lydia's eyes grew wide. "You saw that?" she asked. "Yeah, I saw it, and I saw what you had inscribed, your two girls." "Seriously, is Jenny his daughter?" "Tell me, wife," he said. "He's her uncle and my brother-in-law," she said. "That's all?" Avery asked. "Please don't insult my intelligence. I saw the looks everyone at your office gave me. I'm not stupid." "It's not what you think," she said. "Yeah, right." "Sorry, I don't believe you," he said. "Look, you've been asking what I want for Christmas. Right now, all I want is your signature." "My signature?" she asked. "On the divorce papers," he said. "Divorce?" she asked. "I don't want a divorce. I love you." "You're my husband," she said. "Sure you do," he said. "When you spread your legs for another man, that's exactly what you're saying. I know a lot more than you may think, so don't lie to me. I just want to know two things." "What?" she asked. "Why and how long?" he said. Lydia's eyes fell to the floor. "It's been going on since a few months after I started with the firm," she said. "You mean this has been going on for most of our marriage?" he asked. She nodded. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't want to hurt you. It was only sex, and Robert said you got off on it, didn't you? Remember anything I told you about Robert? Did I ever give you any indication that I would enjoy being cuckolded?" Avery asked. "I'm sorry. He was just so slick and charming. I did everything I could to keep you from finding out." "When did my father get in on the action?" he asked. Lydia's eyes grew wide. "How did you know?" she asked. "It doesn't matter how," he said. "How long have you been screwing my father?" "That started about a year ago," she said. "We were all very careful. We really didn't want to hurt you." "Am I Jenny's father?" he asked. "Of course you are," she said. "You'll forgive me if I don't believe you," Avery responded. "I'll have DNA tests done to find out for sure." "How dare you?" she began, before Avery exploded. "No," he said. "How dare you? You know how much I hated that scumsucker, but you just had to go and screw him anyway, and my father. No, all of this is on you, and yes, I'm filing for divorce. All these years, I've loved you and you alone. I'm the one who took care of you when you were sick, and I'm the one who took care of Jenny because you were too busy. You were my life, and you stabbed me in the back. Now leave me alone. I'll try not to screw up the holiday for Jenny, but you and your affair partner better not screw with me." He grabbed a few things and set up house in his office. He avoided his wife as much as he could and said nothing to her. He spent as much time as he could with his daughter, knowing that soon he would become a part-time father. Ben contacted him later, telling him he had some new video. "Looks like you really stirred up a hornet's nest," Ben said as Avery walked into the office. Ben started the latest video as Avery sat down. The video came from his father's office. As usual, the three lovers were naked, engaging in their usual activity. He knows, Lydia said. Robert and Dan shrugged their shoulders. So what? Robert said. Doesn't change anything. He's filed for divorce, Lydia said. Have you been served yet? Dan asked. Lydia shook her head. Not yet, but I expect it'll happen soon, she said. Well, I guess we'll just have to educate your husband. Let him know the deal. He can either go along or get royally screwed, Dan said. Just be careful, Lydia said. Don't worry. He's just a stupid cop. He can't do anything to us. Avery sat quietly as the video ended. Be very careful, Ben said. I've already forwarded this to Sally, and I've spoken with your supervisor. He tells me he'll have patrols out keeping an eye on things. Ben handed him a key to an apartment he had arranged for Avery to stay at for a while. Avery thanked him before heading out. On Christmas morning, Lydia asked if he was going to his parents' house. Yeah, I'll be there, he said. She bent down to kiss him, but he waved her off. Save it for your lovers, he said. Please don't screw up Christmas, she said as she walked out with Jenny. You mean any more than you've already screwed it up? He asked. Go on, get out of here. I'll be along shortly after. He saw Lydia leave and put his uniform on, making sure he had his body armor. He already had most of his clothes and personal items packed and in his car. He called the process server to verify the time he would be at the Wilson residence and arranged to meet him there, then called his shift supervisor to have a patrol car standing by. He timed his arrival carefully and met the process server a block away. The man got into his car, and he pulled up in front of the house. They got out, and Avery rang the bell. Avery's father answered the door and looked shocked when he saw his son and another man. What's the meaning of this, Avery? He asked. You don't need to ring the bell, Avery said. We've all been wondering when you were going to get here, Dan said. Please, Mr. Wilson, Avery said in his best cop voice, his hand on his sidearm. I'm here on official business. Is Lydia Wilson here? Yes, she is. You know that, Dan said. Please come in. Avery shook his head. Not today, Mr. Wilson. Have Mrs. Wilson come to the door, please, Avery said. Dan nodded and motioned for Lydia, who showed up with Jenny. The process server addressed her. Mrs. Lydia Wilson, he asked. She nodded as he verified her identity and handed her the envelope. You've been served. Lydia began crying as she opened the envelope. You're serving me with divorce papers on Christmas? She asked, tears streaming down her cheeks. How could you? That's a lot better than what you and my former family had planned for me, Avery said. Jenny started crying as she watched her mother and looked up at her father. He knelt down and hugged his daughter. What's going on, Daddy? She asked. I'm sorry, sweetheart, but your mother has decided she doesn't love me anymore, he said, holding her as she cried. I'll see you as soon as I can. Never forget that I love you, okay? Jenny, crying, turned to her mother and kicked her in the shins. I hate you, she cried as she ran away. Dan pushed his way beside a wailing Lydia. How dare you come here and disrupt our family Christmas, he bellowed. Mr. Wilson, consider yourself fortunate that I'm not going to arrest you and the rest of your family for conspiracy, Avery said, handing him another envelope that contained pictures and video from their trysts at the Marriott. He was very careful not to include anything recorded in their offices. By now, Barbara and Robert had come to the door. What's going on? Barbara asked. Avery just served Lydia with divorce papers, Dan said. He knows, Barbara said, stepping back, her face turning white. Yes, and I know all about what the four of you had planned for me, Avery said. I suggest you look very carefully at the protection order and follow it to the letter. I will have no problem arresting you if you violate it. Protection order? Robert shouted. Why, I ought to kick your bum right now, he added, reaching out to Avery. Dan intercepted him as Avery prepared to pull his sidearm. Don't touch him, stupid, Dan yelled. Robert pulled his hand back. Dan looked at Avery. Okay, a-hole, if that's the way you want to play it. You could have been part of something great, but you blew it, he said. I thought I was part of something great, Avery said. He looked at Lydia. I'll call you after the first and schedule a time when I can get the rest of my things. In the meantime, I suggest you obey the order and stay away from me. Okay, she said. I am sorry, she added. Yeah, Avery said. Goodbye. Merry Christmas. Avery went to the apartment Ben had set up for him and unpacked. Merry Christmas indeed, he said. He spent the rest of the day drowning his sorrows in a bottle of Jack Daniels. The next week, he received a call from his father. I want to see you in my office this afternoon, Dan ordered. Avery laughed. People in hell want ice water too. Ain't going to happen. Have you forgotten about the protection order? If you want to meet, you can call my attorney and arrange a meeting at her office with her present. He ended the call before Dan could say anything else and contacted Sally. She wasn't thrilled that he called during her holiday time off, but she listened to what Avery said and agreed to meet with Dan, Robert, and Lydia in her office. She also agreed to contact Dan and set it up. That afternoon, the five of them met in a conference room at Sally's office. Couldn't this have waited until after the new year? Sally asked. No, it couldn't, Dan said. Are you Mrs. Wilson's attorney? Sally asked. Dan looked at Robert. Robert Wilson and I are both her attorneys, he said. I guess you really don't care about things like conflicts of interest, do you? Sally asked. Well, we'll see what the state bar has to say about that, Dan said. What's so important that you just had to meet with my client during the holiday? Sally asked. Dan pulled a folder out of his briefcase and set it on the table. I want Avery to call off this stupid divorce and sign this agreement, he said. Sally read the paper inside and laughed. She handed the paper to Avery, who also read it, not believing what he was seeing. You honestly expect my client to sign away his rights as a husband and agree to let his wife have sex with you and his brother? Mr. Wilson, you're out of your mind. And rest assured, I am going to take this before the state bar. Now get out of my office before I have you thrown out, she said. I'm going to destroy you, Dan told Avery. When I'm finished with you, you'll wish to God you'd never been born. You do know it's a violation of the law to communicate a threat against a police officer, Sally said. Get out before I have you all arrested. Red-faced, Dan, Lydia, and Robert left the office. Avery apologized to Sally and thanked her profusely. I can't wait to get that a-hole in front of a judge, she said as she locked up her office. Avery kept his word and called Lydia after the new year to schedule a time to pick up the rest of his things. She told him that no one would be at the house, and he naively believed her. As soon as he entered the house, he felt a prick on his neck before everything went dark. He was still groggy when he realized he was tied to a chair. He tried to move but couldn't and realized tape had been placed over his mouth. He struggled but wasn't able to free himself. He heard someone mention taking his life before he saw a brilliant flash of light. That was the last thing he remembered before waking up in the hospital. John's rehab had gone better than anyone could have imagined. Not only had he regained his memory, but his body had recovered quite well, and he now felt as strong as he ever had. He noticed that the doctors had done some reconstructive surgery on his face, apparently in an effort to deal with the scars from the shooting. It wasn't much and left some small scars, but it was enough to make him look considerably different than before. Ben had also provided him with special contacts intended to disguise the color of his eyes. According to Ben, his daughter had a habit of visiting his grave site at least once a week, usually on Tuesday mornings on her way to school. John wanted to see Jenny up close and personal, and they decided it would be best if he could disguise his eye color when they finally met. They had also agreed on a plan of revenge, which would be set in motion when John was released from rehab. Fortunately, today was the day. Ben arrived at the rehab center as John was getting his final instructions. He gathered his belongings and went to his friend's car. On the way to the apartment Ben had set up for him, they discussed their plan of action and agreed not to start until John had a chance to meet Jenny. Once at the complex, Ben helped his friend carry his belongings upstairs. John looked around at the one-bedroom apartment. He was impressed with the furniture Ben had picked out for him and was especially impressed with the very large flat-screen television mounted on the wall. After showing him around, Ben handed him the keys to the apartment, the keys to a brand-new SUV, and his new bank cards. John had reintroduced himself to the latest technology while in rehab, learning how to use a smartphone and the latest Windows operating system. He was able to start using the new computer Ben had set up in the front room. After thanking his friend, John settled in for the rest of the day. He took the SUV out for a spin later, just to get the feel of driving. He knew he would have to get used to driving in Southern California again, and he wasn't looking forward to that at all. He stopped at a liquor store and picked up a bottle of Jack Daniels and a pack of cigarettes. He hadn't smoked since he joined the police force, but he felt the old urge and figured that since he was already technically dead, it didn't matter anymore. He got back home and rested for the day, watching some television. After relaxing with a glass of JD and a cigarette, he went to bed for the night. He woke up early the next day, showered, dressed, and headed out for the cemetery, hoping to get there before Jenny. He found the grave marker and took a seat to wait, nursing the cup of coffee he bought on the way. Soon, he spotted her walking down the path. He put his nearly empty cup in the trash bin and got up. She stopped at the grave and seemed to be saying something when he stepped up next to her. She looked at him before speaking. "Did you know my father?" she asked. He nodded. "Yes, as a matter of fact, I did. We were in the army together," John said, extending his hand. "Smith." "John Smith," he added. Jenny took his hand and looked at him carefully. "Jenny Wilson." "Good to meet you, Mr. Smith." "Please, call me John," he said. She smiled before turning back to the grave marker. "He was a hero, you know," she said. "He served on the police force too." Tears came to her eyes as she spoke. "You really miss your father, don't you?" John asked. She nodded. "I haven't seen him since I was 8 years old," she said. "I miss him so much. I like to come here early in the morning and say hello. My mother would kill me if she knew." "Really?" John asked. "Yeah," she said. "She married my uncle after my dad was killed. My dad had just filed for divorce. He was killed shortly afterward." "Do you know how it happened?" John asked. "Supposedly he was shot by a burglar," she said. "I take it you don't believe that?" John said. She shook her head. "My dad was the best cop there was." "I don't believe he was caught by surprise," she said. "I can't prove otherwise, though." "What do you think happened?" John asked. "I don't know," she said. "I just can't believe a burglar caught him by surprise." John nodded. "It happens, you know," he said. "Yeah, but not to my dad," Jenny said. "So, if you don't mind my asking, have you decided what you want to do with your life?" "I don't mind," Jenny said. "I plan on going to UCLA this fall. I want to be a lawyer, but not like my mother or my uncle. I want to be a prosecutor. I want to put bad guys away. I think I owe it to my dad." "Your dad would be very proud of you," John said, tears coming to his eyes. He wanted so much to wrap his arms around this girl and tell her it was going to be okay and that he was proud of her. She looked at him for a while before speaking. "I have to get going now, John. Would you mind if we stayed in touch? I don't know why, but I feel safe with you even though we just met. Something about you reminds me of my dad," she said. John smiled. "Sure, Jenny. May I give you my number? Please feel free to call me anytime you need to." "Sure," she said, smiling. "I hope you don't mind if I call at odd hours." He shook his head. "Not at all, Jenny. Call me anytime you want." They exchanged numbers, and Jenny left. He headed for his SUV and didn't see Jenny put his discarded coffee cup in a plastic bag. He also didn't see her write down the number on his license plate. John left the cemetery and headed for Griffith Park Observatory. It was time to put the plan into motion. Once he got there, he looked out over the city, a place where he once served as a police officer. He pulled out 2 of the burner phones Ben had purchased. He activated the first one, set the number to private, and connected the voice changer device Ben had given him. He selected the effect he wanted and then dialed a number. A woman answered on the second ring. He recognized the voice as Lydia's. "Lydia Wilson," she said abruptly. "Why did you kill me?" he asked before hanging up. He quickly turned the phone off and removed the battery. Unknown to him, Lydia had just left a meeting with some of her husband's backers when the call came in. She heard the message and tried to respond, but the call had already ended. She thought it sounded like her deceased husband, Avery, but she couldn't be sure. Surely Avery wasn't calling her from the grave, she said to herself. She thought about returning the call until she realized the incoming number was set to private. She knew her current husband had enemies and wondered if the call came from one of them. John, meanwhile, had activated the second phone. This time he used it to send a text message to Robert's phone with an attached picture. The caption read, "Remember my promise," and the photo was one recently taken of Robert just outside his office with a set of crosshairs over his groin. After he confirmed the message was sent, he turned off the phone and removed the battery. Both phones were later smashed, with the pieces dropped in various trash bins around the area. Robert, of course, saw the photo and read the caption. He knew it referred to the promise Avery had made to him on his wedding day so long ago. But this was impossible, he thought. Avery had been dead for 10 years, and no one, not even Lydia, knew what his younger brother had told him. Things were tense in the Wilson household that night. Robert and Lydia shared their experience with each other but chalked it up to a political enemy and thought no more about it. John followed the plan he and Ben had agreed to and waited 3 days before making his second round of calls. This time he traveled to nearby Orange County and sent a screenshot of the video showing Robert shooting him to Lydia. The message caption simply read, "Your sins will find you out." The call to Robert's phone was also different. This time he whispered, "Remember, I can blow your balls off from 1,000 yards away," before hanging up. As before, he destroyed both phones and deposited the pieces in various trash bins before heading back home. Both Robert and Lydia were getting very nervous by now. No one but them and Avery knew of the events in that bedroom 10 years ago, and Avery was dead. How could this be happening? They asked each other. Following the plan John and Ben laid out, no more calls or text messages were sent out for a couple of days. John knew that Ben was busy getting information on Robert, so he spent his free time catching up with the events of the last 10 years. Then he received a call. Opening his smartphone, he noticed that it was from Jenny. "John Smith," she said. He answered, "Hi, John. This is Jenny. Remember me?" He smiled. He could never forget his little girl. "Sure," he said. "What can I do for you?" "Can we meet tomorrow morning at my dad's grave about 6 a.m.? she asked. "Of course. I'll be there." "Is everything all right?" he asked. "I need to talk to someone really badly," she said. "Okay, I'll see you there in the morning," he told her. "Thanks," she said before hanging up. He wondered what it was she needed to talk to him about. The next day, he sat at the bench near the gravesite and waited for Jenny. She arrived right on time and sat next to him. "Good morning," he said. She returned the greeting. He could tell she was very nervous about something. "Penny for your thoughts," he said. She looked at the grave and then back at him. She opened her purse, pulled out an envelope, and handed it to him. "What's this?" he asked. "You know, I remember the last time I ever saw my dad alive," she said. "After the funeral, my mother married my Uncle Robert, and he insisted I call him Dad. I refused, even though it made my mother mad. He kept telling me that he was my father, but I didn't believe him. Now I have the truth." She looked at his face. "You are?" John was shocked. How could she know? He wondered. She pointed to the envelope. "I'm sorry for the intrusion, but after we met, I grabbed your coffee cup and your cigarette butt from the trash. You know those things will kill you, she said. He laughed. Something about you reminded me of that day 10 years ago. You know, you can wear contacts to change the color of your eyes, get facial surgery, change your hair color, even mess up your fingerprints, but you can't change your DNA. They were able to get enough saliva from what I found to identify you as my father with 99.9% certainty. Wow, John said. Ben was right about you. You were resourceful. You're going to make a hell of a prosecuting attorney someday. Jenny smiled. So who are you really, and who's buried in my father's grave if it isn't you? She asked. The man you knew as Avery Wilson died 10 years ago, he said. My name really is John Smith. You can thank the feds for that. The official story is that Avery was killed during a home invasion, but that's not the truth, is it? She asked, not even close? He shook his head. No. I knew it. I want the truth, Dad, she said. You owe me that. He loved hearing her call him Dad, and he knew she was right, but he wasn't sure she could handle the whole truth. Are you really sure about that? He asked. It's a lot worse than you can imagine. He saw tears in her eyes. Yes, I need to know, she said. Things aren't going well at the Wilson household, I take it? John asked. Jenny shook her head. No. Mom and Robert have been on edge the last few days. From what I gather, they've been getting strange calls and text messages, and it's really got them upset. But there's more, isn't there? John asked. Tears flowed down her cheeks even though she tried to keep from crying. Have they hurt you? He asked. She broke down crying, and John wrapped his arms around her. It felt so good to hold his girl again, and he wanted to ease her pain. You'll probably hate me if I tell you, she said. John shook his head. I could never hate you. You're my little princess and always will be. She loved hearing him say that and composed herself as best she could before continuing. Robert has been molesting me, she said quietly. John felt a surge of rage as she spoke. How long has it been going on? He asked. Since I was about 13, she said. The scumsucker, John thought. Have you called 911? He asked. She nodded a couple of times. They sent someone out to examine me, but Mom said it wasn't true. Afterward, they beat me and locked me in my room. They threatened to hurt me badly if I said anything to anyone else. What's on your schedule for today? John asked. Nothing really. School is out, but I can't stand to be around the house anymore, she said. These days, I'm just waiting to graduate so I can move out and go to college, she said. You wanted to see proof. How would you like to come to my place so I can show you? He asked. Her eyes lit up. Really? She asked. Yes, I'd like that a lot, John replied. John pulled out his phone and called Ben. Hi John, what's up? Ben asked. Ben, I need you to come to my place right now. There's been a change of plans, John said. Ben, knowing better than to press his friend, replied, Okay, I'll be right over. John ended the call and walked Jenny to her car. Follow me, he told her. I'm in that SUV over there, he added, pointing to his car. He drove to his apartment, making sure Jenny followed him the whole way. Once they arrived, he escorted Jenny to his apartment and ushered her inside. It's not as nice as your place, but it's home, he said. It's perfect, Dad, Jenny said, looking around. It could use a woman's touch, though. She accepted his offer of coffee, so he turned on his Keurig and let her choose the flavor she wanted. After getting their coffee, they sat down at his table. So where's this evidence? She asked. Are you really sure you want to see this? He asked. It's pretty graphic. I told you I need to see this, she said. John opened his laptop and pulled up the video showing Dan, Robert, and Lydia planning to shoot him, followed by the actual shooting video. Her face turned white, and tears flowed down her cheeks. Oh my God, she said when the video ended. I can't believe they actually plotted to murder you. By then, Ben knocked on the door. John let him in and introduced him to Jenny. "So what's going on?" Ben asked after he sat down. "Jenny knows who I am," John said, "and she tells me that Robert has been molesting her for years. I can't just sit here and let that go on." Ben nodded. "I understand," he said. "So you think it's time to ramp things up?" "I do," John said. Ben thought for a minute before speaking. He looked at Jenny and asked, "Would you be willing to help us?" "Oh yes, anything I can do to help," she said. Ben looked at John. "We could use a set of eyes and ears in the Wilson house. Maybe she can set up some cameras and give us surveillance there."